This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and it's my pleasure to have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
I gather you just got off a plane from Hawaii?
Yeah, about after midnight, but...
And you still have your Hawaiian shirt on?
Yeah, that's right. I thought we'd sort of use that as an informal, to show that, you know, we're informal here, but serious nonetheless.
Charles, I'm going to jump right in so we don't have a shortage of time. And on a serious subject, we got tremendous feedback on the crony capitalism video we did last time we were together. And I thought we would springboard from it to also some other things that you're writing on America's terminal political dysfunction. Kind of a complicated subject, but it really key words and key messages in each one of those words. Let's just spring forward why we have crony capitalism. You had some points that you wanted to raise on, or how specifically how crony capitalism works.
Well, Gordon, I think the core of crony capitalism is the marriage of the central state, you know, the federal government, and corporate lobbying. And so those two entities end up helping each other. And there's several aspects of that which we've covered, and we don't need to go into great depth, but the one is the revolving door, where the regulators work for the corporations, and then they leave the corporations and become regulators. And so that is part of crony capitalism, that you're not going to go very hard on your future employer, because you're gonna get a very cushy several $100,000 a year position if you tread lightly. So there's a personal part of crony capitalism, and then there's the money part, which is buying influence by campaign contributions and direct lobbying. And so the end result, which is so dangerous to democracy, is reform becomes impossible, because anybody that's a powerful political group or constituency can veto anything that imposes any political or financial pain on them. And so crony capitalism is not just it's insidious, because it undermines democracy, and it undermines true, you know, classical capitalism, which requires transparent markets and competition. So those are exactly what's wiped out in crony capitalism.
I think, Charles, is the key is to understand the key bono in here. Who's being paid and how they're being paid and how the money transacts, because the payouts are something that you go to prison for. So I don't believe for one moment there is a tremendous amount of actual money that's transacted in these processes. I think it's of the Roman tribute kind of system, where it's influence. So the money eventually does flow in the process. And so, as you pointed out, the regulators right now, a lot of them, by the nature of where they are even positioned, for example, in the Federal Reserve is responsible for controlling the banks, for regulating the banks. So if you're working for the Federal Reserve as a bank regulator, your office is at that bank. It's not at the Federal Reserve, it's at that bank. So you're living with the enemy, if you would. And that makes sort of sense, right? So you're close to it, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're on top of things. But then who is your boss? So you're there, but who is your boss? Well, your boss is the Federal Reserve, but the bank regulations in the United States report up to the regional banks, not to Washington, the Federal Reserve at Washington, but each the regional banks, so the New York Fed. And who runs the New York Fed? Well, if you look at it, the board of directors are voted in by the local banks, so they're the banks. Not like in Washington where there's some particular political appointments. So you raise up a serious issue as a regulator. Who's the one that's going to say, yeah, come and sue me? Or somebody at the bank in that infrastructure can shut it down. But I'm not suggesting they would. The nature of the process would be, would you really want to do that, Charles, if you were a regulator? Would you want to be blowing that whistle? Ever mind the fact that you're also on a day-to-day basis living with these people at the bank. That the whole system makes it very, very difficult for you to want to fix the problem. And over a period of time, and this has been going on for a lot of years, it's not really a good system. What's your comments on that?
Absolutely, Gordon. You structure it such that you're supposed to be policing the folks down the hall who you have coffee with every day. Are you really going to pursue an indictment that puts that guy in jail, even though he may deserve it? Highly unlikely. It's very uncomfortable to do that. And of course, all these players have batteries of attorneys who are careful to make sure that whatever is being done is to the letter of the law, even if it violates the spirit of the law. And that's part of the tribute system that you're describing. Is the letter of the law is always met, so that I don't have to indict the guy down the hallway. You know, the disclosure was buried on page 117, and everything is by the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, i.e. protecting the public interests and the public good, that's been violated simply by the structure that you described.
Charles, I don't want to suggest that I think there's bad, evil people in this process. I think the vast majority are good people who either on the bank side or on the regulator side who want to do the right thing, but the system itself puts them into very compromising positions.
Absolutely.
And then they take their lead from others who might not be quite as by the line for whatever sets of reasons. So, it's like the old thing, bad money forces out good money. So, in the regulators, people need to understand, if you had an issue and you were at any of the regulators, on one side of the table, you've got the regulators. And what they've did, a lot of cases, they're young, they're fresh out of law school, they're making less than six figures, and they may, 2-3 years kind of experience. The boss may have a number of years. On the other side of the table are sitting people where the lawyers are big law firms making multi-million dollars of a year. By the way, 30 years ago had that job on the other side of the table and have forgotten more than you, the 2-year or 4-year regulator, understand. And so if you open your mouth, you being the regulator, you'll get it. You will be chapter and verse by somebody who make you look so stupid. So you're a little tenuous about being very aggressive. Not only that, your future is to really get on the other side of that table because you have a big mortgage, especially if you live in New York and you're commuting, right? You don't want to be living out in the Bronx or up in the Bronx. So it's not all people. Definitely, but it puts you into these compromising positions. We just had a whistleblower this week who tape recorded nearly 40 hours, and I don't know if you've had a chance, Charles, to hear any of it, but 40 hours of conversation, they as a regulator, and Goldman Sachs specifically, which really gives you a sense of how difficult it is to be a regulator and the unspoken rules that would go on. And if you haven't heard or read the kinds of the transcripts, I strongly recommend our listeners to do it. Have you heard them?
I have only read a summary, but Gordon, I'd like you to speak to something that you have several slides to, which is related to this issue you're talking about, how the system breeds an inability to really police. Is that you were tying this crony capitalist feature into imperial Rome and the mafia and the tribute system, which is, again, as you say, unspoken, but it's like a law that doesn't need to be written down.
Exactly, because I also said, it's about money doesn't transact in a lot of cases. It's influence, and it's following the unspoken word. But at the end of the day, it's about money. It always is. You know, the old expression, follow the money. There's a movie out, it's an old movie called The Goodfellas, and it's about the mafia. And in it, there's a great, great line where and Paulie, who's the Don in this particular movie, The Goodfellas, where the guy, the star of the show says, what the police and the FBI never understood is how it works and why Paulie, the Don, had his job and the purpose of the Don. And the Don was to be the police department for those who can't go to the police. So if no matter what crooked angle you had, there were certain rules. If you broke them, Paulie was going to come and slap your hand. You didn't take out a good fellow or a made man, etc. You know, I mean, there's just certain things you didn't do. But when you committed your crime, you gave Paulie a piece of it, a tribute, 10%, 20%. You gave him his amount, and though he had nothing to do with the crime, because it allowed you to continue. Well, that system, that tribute system came from the Roman days, when Rome wouldn't invade a country because you'd pay them a tribute, call it a ransom, call it extortion. There's some pretty ugly names in the process. but that effectively is what's, I don't think by design, has evolved into the American political system. And we all understand lobbyists and the think tanks and the influence peddling that goes on. But the real money here to me is, and it's in these kinds of charts, where you see huge misdeeds that are done. Let's take the mortgage banking system, the 2008 financial crisis. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars illegally taken. Matter of fact, there's no question about that to debate it. Nobody went to prison, mind you, which is a big part of the tribute system. But what we have is we have fines that are imposed on these people who committed these crimes. But the fines, and this is what the whistleblower pointed out too, are like 25 or 40 or 80 million dollars. That sounds incredibly heavy. What's 80 million on $800 billion crime? 10%? Hey, that's the tribute level, isn't it? And if you go through that, that's almost what they're working out. Nobody gets charged. Nobody goes to prison. Nobody gets a felon. Nobody gets fired. And you just pay a fine. Government lies it because we just picked up $100 million. So the government, by the way, that's getting to be a big chunk of a relative tax base, isn't it, Charles?
Yeah.
What am I missing here?
Right. No, as you say, Gordon, does it pass our common sense test of how a regulatory system should work? And I think we need to just focus a little bit on what you just said, that imagine that we're somebody who's overseeing that criminal skimming, if you will, at the corporate level, and we're making very good money. We're going to pull a couple $1 million in bonus. And when the thing falls apart and we have to pay the tribute, the fine to the federal government, I'm not going to lose any of my bonus, and neither are you. It's the corporation who's going to pay, and we don't care. We have suffered no pain or loss whatsoever. So where's the disincentive to pursuing the next quasi-legal skim? There's no disincentive whatsoever. There's a great incentive. We'll make another couple $1 million each in bonus.
Yeah. They debated having clawbacks, but they stopped that. That quietly went away. No, yeah. So you take the money out, and the corporations themselves, so those are the executives that would be incented, maybe not even knowingly. They think that they're just making sure they're getting their bonus, and they're pushing they're pushing the envelope. But the corporations themselves, they're making huge profits on these things. And so, where's the line there?
Right. And I think, Gordon, what I think we need to kind of pull back from the description that we've made of the tribute system and crony capitalism to, like, what's the systemic structural consequences of this kind of system. And what we find is there can never be any serious reform, because every player in the system can veto anything that adversely affects them. So you have the banks, with their lobbying and influence and so on, can squash any reform that might actually threaten their profits. And then you have the Department of Defense contractors, they can squash anything. The Medicare folks can squash anything that might trim their take. And so then you have a system where everybody's pursuing their own special interests and protecting them, while the entire economy and society are slowly falling apart.
Exactly. I like to stress again, Charles, I don't think there's a lot of bad people here.
Precisely.
I think they're good people just trying to, pay their mortgages, trying to get their kids through school, but they're caught up in a system that's evolved and puts them into terribly compromised positions. And then it's like Charles Prince, the head of Citigroup, said before the 2008 crisis, the risks that they were taking. He says, look, you got to get up and dance while the music's playing. He knew the risks the banks were taking was too much. But how was he supposed to pull back, in his mind, pull back less profit because somebody else the mortgage brokers would have pushed themselves in and taken that business. They wouldn't have had the earnings, and he would have been removed from his job. So he says, well, I kind of gotta do it. And then he goes to the lawyers. And if there's a bad person in this, it's the lawyers. But the lawyers are doing their job. He'd say, where's the line? And the lawyers would say, well, here's the line, and you can get up this close. You can't quite do this or it'd be illegal. Okay? And he says, well, what would happen if we were there? He says, well, we'd probably get a fine. But, or you shouldn't do it, or you could do it this way. This would be my calculated gamble. So the lawyers are advising them, doing their job. And with client-attorney privilege, the dialogues that they would get into, deciding where that line would really be and what the penalties would be, leads to this gray area. And this is where this tribute system works. It's all kind of the gray area. Again, even the lawyers themselves aren't necessarily bad. They're just doing their job, telling them where the line is. Then we get into the lobbyists saying, well, I can move the line a little bit. And so when that system becomes systemic, which we now have, crony capitalism is inevitable because it's just good business. You're actually, Charles, forced to do this. Because with aggregate demand shrinking that we have, with real disposable incomes being compressed right now, because of inflation and the government printing more money, and that's what's going on, you can't get top-line growth anymore. You've played financial engineering on the bottom. You've got to chase margins. And the way to get margins, build a moat, regulatory arbitrage, get some kind of competitive advantage, work against your competition in such a way. So government lobbying of the regulations and the regulatories becomes a competitive mandate. It's not even optional anymore.
That's precisely right. And we've touched on that in the past, Gordon, that your return on investment is so much higher for influence and lobbying. For instance, $1 million is not a lot of money now, but it'll buy you significant political influence. $1 million contribution is significant to a politician. If you and I were going to do R&D, $1 million isn't going to do much research and development. If we were going to launch a new product nationally, that's a drop in the bucket. We'd need to spend $100 million, and it might not work. Whereas with the lobbying, it's guaranteed to work. Because as you say, we're getting a protection from our profit source, and it's something that we can control. And so that sets up this weird feedback. We're making more money the more we lobby. That gives us more profit, which we can then devote to buying more influence. And so the competition is crushed.
Charles, I just did a show with John Rubino.
Okay.
And John showed the number of politicians, senators and congressmen in the last two Congresses who have left to become lobbyists. The list was gigantic, just unbelievably large. Even I was shocked, and I can be cynical on some of these subjects. But to your point, the money that can be made is so large, it's measured in billions and in some cases trillions of dollars, compared to the salaries that you pay people. That's going to be a $60, $100, $200, $300,000 kinds of salary. It's insignificant. You can afford to have thousands of lobbyists working for the kinds of games that can be played. That's when it really kind of shows up. And look at Look at our House Whip, who just left in the Senate, who couldn't win a primary, and I'm sure he's a very honest man, but he left for Wall Street. And look at the salary that he immediately commands. And all of these are in areas that have influence going forward. Ever mind influence at the time. So, as John said, you know, a politician today is nothing more but a protracted job interview.
That's an excellent summary. And I think again, to go back to our sort of conclusion of this discussion is the real economy is stagnating because, you know, tribute skims off productive wealth and transfers it to the hands of the few. And so it's a wealth transfer mechanism and it bleeds the rest of the economy. And so, you know, we can look at all the statistics about, oh, there's some few 100,000 more low-paying jobs have been created, yay. But in terms of the overall productivity of our economy, it's stagnating. And one of the primary sources is crony capitalism and the tribute system we've described.
Exactly, exactly. We forget that capitalism is about savings, and savings that are reinvested to create wealth. We are a 71% consumption economy now, Charles. That doesn't leave any savings. Matter of fact, we have no savings. The remaining part, the other 29%, is really government transfer payments now. Very little import-export and very, very little investment. So there's no investment left to create the wealth. Because credit is not wealth. You know, it's got to be turned into productive assets. So you get this squeeze. That's the bottom line. When you have a sustainable 71% consumption for a period of time, something gives. And you print money, which we're doing, which will buy you more time. But what it does is it forces the behavior and shift, and that behavioral shift becomes crony capitalism or living off the government. And then the influencing of the rules, regulations, enforcement that gives you a competitive advantage. Capitalism shifts, it becomes a completely different business model. You and I are using the words crony capitalism. It's inevitable, Charles. This can be foreseen to be a lot. It's in the human nature. The question on the table as we wrap here is, what can we do about it? What should be done about it? Or can nothing be done about it?
Yeah, and that's a difficult question. And you have a chart showing how crony capitalism is part of a stair step up to a number of structural crises. And that's where we can predict there will be crises. There will be crises in unfunded liabilities. There'll be political crises. There are consequences to eroding, you know, your system with crony capitalism, and we will eventually deal with those consequences in a crisis mode, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, but I think it's why we're doing this tape, Charles. Is the more people that are aware of what is wrong here and why it's wrong, because we're responsible for the change, to make these an issue. But I think a lot of people don't really fully understand what's going on, and make it really simple too. You know, capitalism, you get more for less. When you get to this, you get less for more. And eventually you're going to get a lot less for a lot more, because the bleed out of the system, whether to the tribute system, whether it's to the government and transfer payments, whether it's to more dependencies on the government, takes away from the productive capacity of a country. That's the issue. Charles, we got a break. Closing comments?
I think your summary about getting more for less and less for more perfectly sums up the consequence to us as households and individuals and small business.
Talk to you again next month.
Okay, great, Gordon. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. Talk to you. Bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.